Hi, my name's William Henderson,
And I'm B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So we're affiliated with B. McGraw's website.
Which is the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
So unlike your website, instead of making parody articles about various topics, we'll look at actual academic research on various topics.
And someone
and basically look at what's happening.
Someone the other day asked me, I was just like, wait, why is it Unjerked? And we explained this in one of the earlier episodes. It's a counterpoint to the subreddit culture for the satirical subreddits of since the satirical subreddits are the circle jerk websites, and then when you say something that's sincere, you say unjerked, and then the sincere thing. This is that podcast.
Yeah, and one thing I've kind of realized doing this podcast, so there's obviously like the obvious BS subreddits that are like, oh, well, we should, I don't want to give examples, but obvious just crap. But even a lot of, I've realized even most Reddit threads about that seem semi-legit are basically like complete BS. Like,
yeah, that's pretty normal.
I've kind of realized basically every single Reddit post is just hearsay is kind of what I've realized.
That's the common thread here. Although we do find some that turn out to be real. So, yeah. Sometimes the no smoke without fire is a true adage.
Yeah. So this episode is going to be on welfare. So should welfare exist? Essentially, we're going to dig into this. So to start out with, before we go into detail, so what is in and out of scope as far as welfare goes? So I'm not going to talk, for the most part, I'm not going to talk about workers' benefits, labor protections, as well as guaranteed worker benefits like paid leave and parental leave, just because, I don't know if that really counts as welfare. That's more sort of regulations around labor. And I'm also not going to talk about public infrastructure like transportation because, that's not what people think of when they think of welfare. Welfare is mostly cash assistance or other forms of assistance usually based off of some sort of need, whether it be poverty or age, etc. So, in terms of the history of welfare, so before welfare was institutionalized by the government, it usually kind of always existed, usually in the context of various civic organizations. So you had family networks, obviously. You had religious organizations. I think churches and mosques and synagogues have been quite effective ways of helping the poor and vulnerable. You had mutual aid societies, which is like a more secular version of like what churches did in terms of welfare. And then you have charitable giving, which is voluntary contributions to various causes. So that's what used to exist. And you added a circle jerk argument on this, right?
Yes. So this is a common circle jerk I see probably among the trad circle jerk people online of like, why don't we just like go completely back to the traditional style of welfare where it's all through churches, it's all through charitable giving. And I think a lot of the argument is like, you wouldn't even be able to be charitable or, do something good for your soul if it's all like mandated, organized through the government.
So we'll talk about this a little later. I think the big issue is scale.
I saw that.
It's scale and interregional transfer. So if there's a big issue, on the other side of the country, oftentimes government can be more effective in redirecting those funds. In practice, my experience researching this has been that the government actually heavily utilizes local civic organizations in a lot of different programs, whether it be churches or, nonprofits, etc. So I think it's not really an either or. You kind of see the two are kind of intertwined. But the big issue is scale and regional movement, essentially. So, and when did the government start taking over these programs? So it's hard to kind of like
poor laws there. So
yeah, so most societies have had, like I said before, most societies have had usually religious focused welfare programs. Medieval Muslim countries had pretty robust programs. Analogous programs existed in medieval Christian societies. It was basically, you had a tithe, you had to give a certain percentage of your income to your local church, and then they use that for welfare systems. But in terms of like a governmental programs, the big program, one big thing you saw was these English poor laws. And they were first, they went back as early as like the 1300s, etc. But the sort of main ones really started in at the very tail end of the 1500s with the Elizabethan poor law. So this is when Elizabeth I was the Queen of England. And essentially, this was actually before Great Britain existed. This was before the Act of Union. So English poor law is basically an early form of governmental welfare. And so those sort of existed starting then. And then obviously the American colonies inherited a lot of that, because American law is largely based off of British common law.
What were the poor laws?
I mean, I don't know the extent to which, how expansive were they, but I mean, it's basically basic welfare, giving money to poor people, essentially. And then the sort of significant event that happened was the New Deal, as far as the American context goes. So in the 1930s, you had a massive, massive expansion in the welfare state. Social Security was started. I believe, I'm not sure if Medicare was tied to the New Deal. I think Medicaid was the Great Society under LBJ. I don't remember when Medicare happened, but really the 1930s, because in the 1920s and earlier, welfare was mostly like soldiers' pensions, widows' pensions, like that type of stuff.
Yeah, not more than that.
Yeah. So, like we mentioned before, governmental welfare scales better, and it's more effectively can move money between regions. But religious and nonprofit welfare is more flexible to local needs. And so when it comes to local boots on the ground, usually local civic organizations and churches have people who actually live in the community. So they kind of have a better understanding of like what's actually happening. There's pros and cons to both. And so really, if you combine the two, it kind of provides coverage across sort of both pros and cons.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. And then this kind of goes without saying, but in areas where there's like civil wars or the government is very weak, etc., religious and civic organizations kind of are the only option. So it kind of is what it is. So the ideological framework behind welfare, a lot of it kind of goes back to religious philosophy. So almost every major world religion is very pro helping people in need, with very few exceptions.
Can you tell me rationally why I should help people and make it about my self-interest as much as possible?
We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think there are areas in which welfare can make certain people more productive. Basically, if you think of poverty as a localized minima, where it kind of minimizes productivity, like, is it possible to kind of pull someone out of that well and place them on a path to more productivity? So that's sort of the self-interested argument for welfare, is like, because it's not good for anyone to have, an entire sort of class of people who are basically, beggars, essentially.
Yeah, it's pretty awful.
Yeah, it's like these are people who are not economically productive and who are living, pretty, it's not great to live that type of lifestyle, obviously. And it's just like, who does that benefit? It doesn't benefit anyone. So that's sort of the self-interested argument. Although, you can also, I don't think that argument covers all welfare, because I think a lot of
definitely
welfare
not.
I think a lot of
people
welfare
who are like on disability or something, like.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the sort of Nazi eugenicist opinions on disabled people, I mean, they euthanized they killed disabled people in Nazi Germany, and their argument was basically economic. It's like these people are not adding economic productivity, and so from that perspective, I think you have to go beyond economic arguments. You have to, I think you have to make a moral argument of like these people are disabled through no fault of their own, but we should provide some basic human dignity, because that's just, we're all in this together, essentially. So, but traditionally, most welfare usually sprung out of religious arguments, because most societies historically have been religious, or some sort of philosophy, debate about whether Buddhism and Confucianism are religions or philosophies. But anyways, in terms of the founding fathers, the reason I bring the founding fathers up, number one, we're both U.S. citizens, so it kind of is more sort of pertinent to us. But
this is for American religion.
Well, also, I think you're seeing a recent trend in the past 40 years or so of this sort of philosophy, basically saying the founding fathers were basically like, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but people who argue that the founding fathers were basically like Ayn Randian objectivists. And it's just not true at all. Like, no. That's just, if you read, I'm actually currently listening to a biography on John Adams, and I would invite anybody in the audience interested in history to listen to biographies on the various founding fathers, because it really kind of informs you of like, what did they actually think about stuff. But their views on welfare were kind of varied. What you did not see is you did not see social Darwinists among the founding fathers. You did not see people who were like, poor people should just die. Like, nobody said that. No, none of them said that. None of them said that. None of them said that.
Just get out of the way.
Like, some of them were like, hey, like, welfare should be mostly like local programs. Some people supported public works, like Ben Franklin was a huge supporter of like education, libraries, etc. The big guy who is like really in favor of what we would consider welfare in the modern context is Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. So the Social Security Administration has an article talking about this. But Thomas Paine in 1795 to 96 wrote his last pamphlet, Agrarian Justice. And it was essentially he basically advocated for a social insurance scheme for the aged and young people.
Oh, interesting.
The fund was to be financed by a 10% tax on inherited property. So it was a theoretical framework for a form of, I guess, an estate tax. Thomas Paine, he was quite a radical, but he was also sort of a populist. I guess he would be kind of like probably like a Bernie Sanders type character.
Oh, interesting. I haven't thought about him since I had to memorize the fact that he wrote Common Sense in 6th grade.
I actually heard his remains were kept by like one of his friends, and apparently they were like lost to history. Like apparently like the guy who was given his remains died, and then during his like estate sale, his like Thomas Paine's skeleton was just like lost, and they don't know where it went, which is kind of crazy to think about. Anyways, that's totally off topic.
Yeah.
Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, he didn't really talk about welfare, but he did talk about like, maybe some markets should be regulated, maybe some goods should be furnished by the government. He wasn't like a hardcore everything should be privately done. He was more focused on private markets than I would argue. Adam Smith, at his core, was an anti-mercantilist. Essentially, he thought mercantilism was not a free enough market, and he wanted a market that provided for more free trade. But he was not by any means a sort of social Darwinist. And then when you move on to the libertarians. So libertarianism was mostly a reaction to, I would say, 20th century statist philosophies, primarily communism and fascism. They did draw from Enlightenment thinking, but it was primarily because communism itself was a reaction to capitalism and industrialization. Fascism was, to a large extent, a reaction to communism, and then libertarianism was a reaction to both communism and fascism. But even many libertarians were okay with certain types of welfare. So Milton Friedman, a very famous libertarian economist, he actually advocated for a negative income tax. So he said, if someone's very, very poor, just tax them a negative percentage, so they get money from the government at the end of the year.
So he said, change the slope of the income tax, but don't change the intercept. Or change the slope and change the intercept.
You change the intercept, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The intercept is not zero. What a concept.
And then F.A. Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom, which is like probably the preeminent book on libertarian thought. But F.A. Hayek, who was also an economist, he was a big sort of Austrian economics guy. But here's a quote from F.A. Hayek. He says, "There is no reason why in a society which has reached the general wealth ours has, the certainty of a given minimum of sustenance should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom, that is, some minimum of food, shelter, and clothing sufficient to preserve health. Nor is there any reason why the state should not help to organize a comprehensive system of social insurance in providing for the common hazards of life against which few can make adequate provision." So even people like F.A. Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom, he's like, yeah, I mean, like, helping poor people, like, that's not like
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, it's like that sounds totally reasonable.
So also for listeners, if you haven't listened to the Hayek versus Keynes epic rap battle, it's probably the most epic of epic rap battles.
Yeah, so in my research for this episode, basically what I kind of saw was that anti-welfare attitudes were not necessarily even a sort of consequence of libertarian philosophy. It was really more a consequence of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is not necessarily tied, it was a sort of interpretation of Darwin's theory of evolution. I would say most people who believe in evolution are not social Darwinists, but a certain subset of people in the 19th century did create this interpretation of basically saying, well, there's certain sort of undesirables in society who should not exist or who should not be supported. So Malthus, I think Malthus preceded Darwin. I'm not completely sure.
He did, if I remember right. Yeah.
So
he was, I think he was active during the potato famine, so I think it was pretty close.
Like I had a professor who was very critical of Malthus and basically said Malthus was like one of the great villains of history. Essentially Malthus's argument was that, there's the more population grows, the more people consume resources, and like basically we should just like essentially kill off poor people. The problem with that argument is that, people consume resources, but people also create resources. Like people do farming and people create intellectual property. And in a society where ideas can scale, you could argue that higher population leads to more productivity because ideas can scale far beyond the initial originator of the idea.
Oh, yeah. And I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, and the Green Revolution, basically, the sort of introduction of fertilizers and various farming practices basically made, fix the problem that Malthus was talking about. And so, like right now, food insecurity is primarily a logistical issue. It's primarily, there's certain parts of the world where there's bad road infrastructure and governance is bad. And so there's not an effective way of moving food to those areas. But like we grow enough food in the world for everybody. So from that perspective, like food insecurity should not exist. It's primarily an issue of governance and logistics. But Malthus was kind of the progenitor of this line of thought, and then it kind of became social Darwinism. And you had this like big eugenicist movement in like the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, which culminated in National Socialism in Germany, the Nazis basically were kind of the extreme interpretation of social Darwinism. And we all know how that turned out.
You know what I think is the new version of this? And I hate to say it because I love that movie, but the movie Idiocracy is the new form of Malthus.
Perhaps. I think that's sort of a bit different, but it is
different, but it's the same vibe.
Yeah. And then I think Ayn Rand was a inheritor of the social Darwinist philosophy. So I actually do believe objectivism, there is something distinct that separates it from libertarianism. I think there's something particularly odious about Ayn Rand's, in my opinion. I didn't read her. I started reading, which book was it? It was Atlas Shrugged. And
I tried getting through that one, and well, it wasn't her ideas. It was her writing style. I don't like her writing style, but I mean, if you read the history of Ayn Rand, it makes sense why she believes what she believes, but that doesn't mean that you should believe it.
She did grow up in Soviet Russia.
Well, she grew up like when her parents basically got fucked by the revolution. Like their parents were rich and lost a lot of their stuff, and basically became not productive members of society. Like they were like middle to upper middle class or something, and then the revolution took it all away.
Yeah. So my opinion, based off my desktop research, is that modern anti-welfare philosophy mostly stems from social Darwinism rather than libertarianism. There's also a Marxist argument against welfare. Primarily, I think Marxist arguments about social democracy are primarily like, oh, well, this will stifle the progress towards the true workers' utopia, that type of crap. And so Marxists are very often against welfare and very often against even labor unions, because those are considered sort of, the same way like independence movements of certain regions, of certain countries. A lot of times those independence leaders don't want autonomy. They don't want to be a part of an autonomous region because that'll kind of placate a lot of the grievances without leading to full independence. And so very often Marxist thinkers are, think that welfare and labor unions basically don't, are impediments from leading to, full, so-called communist paradise. So you added a comment on UBI. We'll talk about that later. So I'll skip that.
All right. Well, we'll save UBI for later because that is a big topic in this conversation. That's pretty hot.
So international comparisons. Most of this is based off this OECD article, OECD statistics article, sizing up welfare states. How do OECD countries compare? So Europe tends towards larger welfare programs, larger welfare states, up to 30% of GDP in France and Italy. However, Ireland is less than 15%. I wonder if that's because of all the money they bring in through basically corporate tax haven type stuff. So 30% of GDP in those countries are spent on welfare? Yeah.
Wow, that's really high.
Yeah, it's pretty high.
That's really high. I didn't know. Wow. And
then the U.S. is kind of in the middle. They spend a decent amount on healthcare and pensions, and per our healthcare episodes, the U.S. actually spends the most on healthcare. The issue is that there's a lot of inefficiencies in the U.S. system, but we also spend a lot on pensions. But then when you look at other welfare outside of healthcare and pensions, that category is quite low. So there's a graph that looks at this. So this graph right here, this is the U.S. spending. So the U.S. does spend a decent amount on pensions and healthcare, but very little on everything else. Interesting. And when you look at the OECD countries with very low welfare spending, it's sort of developing countries, frankly. Mexico, Chile. South Korea is developed, so that's an exception. But Turkey, Costa Rica, etc., Colombia. And then East Asia, so they actually spend, so there's an article called, let's see, The East Asian Welfare Model by Christian Alspelter from 2010, International Journal of Social Welfare. But he basically looks into what the East Asian model is like. And the difference is the East Asian model is very heavily focused on family support. So there is a much stronger social convention focused on family supporting their elderly, etc. They do have welfare on top of that. And so they do fill in the gaps with public welfare. Most East Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, etc., they do have universal health care, for example. But there is a much stronger family bond. And then in the developing world, there's very limited social welfare, just because, they're just poor countries, and so it's just the issue is they have the capital is the issue there. And so it's mostly family focused. The difference between East Asia and developing world systems, so they both rely heavily on family networks. The difference is that, and this is me kind of like thinking through this, but what you see in many East Asian countries is that essentially to become economically productive requires very high investment. And so there's a very high, it's basically the cost of failure is very high, and there's a strong pressure to succeed in getting into very good universities and getting very good high-paying jobs. Whereas in poor countries, the economy is much more focused on agricultural and blue-collar work. And so there's a lower capital expenditure in making your children productive. And so there's a much stronger incentive to just have as many children as possible, because each child, on average, will be productive. And, the more children you have, the more it kind of covers for, some of your children won't end up, being productive. Either, they die because of an accident, or, there's some other issue, or they run away from home, etc. And so the big issue in East Asia is it's very family dependent, but also there's a strong incentive to have like one or two children and put all your resources into those children. So I would, anyways, that's kind of the big main systems of welfare across the world. The types of welfare, I'm not going to go through. I started adding dollar figures to all of them, but I just stopped partway through because it's just too much work. But in the U.S., so you have insurance programs, pensions, food programs, housing programs, education programs, energy subsidies, young family programs, job training, and natural disaster benefits, unemployment benefits, and income assistance. Okay. So health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, VA healthcare, and then CHIP, which is children's healthcare. So that's people who make too much money for Medicaid, but there's a special insurance program for children, for those families. Disability insurance, you have SSI, supplemental security income, and then SSDI, which is a disability insurance program. So they're both administered by the Social Security Administration. SSI is funded by the general tax pool. SSDI is funded by Social Security taxes. And then life insurance, you have Social Security survivor benefits. Pensions, you have old age pensions, which is 85% of the Social Security program. And then you have veteran pensions. And then military pensions, I don't think that's really welfare. That's more just a job benefit.
Yeah.
And then with food programs, there's two big ones, both run by the USDA. One is SNAP and one is WIC. And then you also have local school meal programs. Housing, the big program is Section 8 vouchers. And then you also have local housing projects. And then the VA loan, the Veterans Affairs loan, it exists, but it's actually not a huge, it doesn't cost that much money, because there's a fee that people who enter VA loans pay a fee that covers a lot of the cost of the program. and also veterans in general tend to have, people in the military tend to have, well, by definition, they have regular incomes. And so they're considered a lower risk pool from that perspective. And so VA loans are actually not that costly for the government. And then education, you have Pell Grants, which are grants for poor people, poor students. You have the GI Bill, which is for veterans. And then you have the Head Start program, which is like education supporting programs for low-income children. There's one big energy subsidy I didn't know about called the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP. One of those situations where the acronym itself is very long. For young families, you have the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, and then you have Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. So those are the two big programs for young families. You also have job training programs. Universal basic income is not really a thing anywhere.
No,
and then
not
you have,
really.
Yeah, and then you have natural disaster assistance, which, I don't know if that's really welfare, but I just kind of added it here. And then you have unemployment benefits, which are mostly local. You have income assistance, which is, again, mostly TANF. And those are the big programs. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, that was one thing I was thinking of when I looked at everything. And this is kind of a preemptive argument that I see towards a lot of circle jerk arguments, is that a lot of people say, oh, well, I think the primary arguments against welfare is one, that the government's going to mismanage money and it'll be corrupt and it'll go in the wrong hands. And then two, if you create these programs for people to get welfare to live off of basically no productive work, then they're going to do that rather than get a job or have productive work. So of course people are going to do that and take advantage of the system. And I think this is like the massive amount of different welfare programs, as you've kind of listed out and talked about, is kind of the natural conclusion of how do you make a welfare system that's resistant to that, is that you have a lot of different buckets for different needs, so that one, people don't take advantage of it, and then two, you have different administrations to try and dole out the money correctly to the right people. And then it turns into an argument per organization of, are they getting taken advantage of people, and can people take advantage of them? Is it incentivizing people to stay on whatever welfare from being unemployed, or have tons and tons of kids so they can keep getting that earned income tax credit or whatever? So people can argue about all of that, but I think those are the general anti-welfare vibes in the U.S.
In terms of waste and fraud, we'll talk about that later. The numbers are actually quite low.
Oh, really?
So yeah, that's actually not a huge issue. In terms of disincentive to work, that can definitely be a thing.
Interesting.
Especially when it comes to eligibility cliffs. So if there's a hard cutoff on when you're eligible versus not eligible for a certain program, that can create a problem where it's like there's a localized minima or maxima, where it's like, hey, like maybe if I made a ton more money, that'd be better than me being on welfare. But if I made like an extra $1,000 a year, I'd be kicked off of welfare and I'd have way less money coming in. Like that is absolutely something that can happen. So I think that is actually a legitimate argument.
Okay. Here's a counter circle jerk argument to that circle jerk argument, is that to try and compensate for so much squander and fraud to the welfare program, they make it so complicated that just getting your welfare is in itself a part-time job, and it's so complicated that you miss a lot of people that need the help, or that they can't navigate the system or something.
Yeah, that's also a very valid argument, and we'll talk about that later. ease of the simplicity of the program is something that really matters a lot. You talked about UBI here. So UBI has not been tried anywhere. There have been some pilots done, but the issue with the pilots is that they're not UBI, because a UBI means universal, and a pilot by definition is not universal. It's like, hey, we'll do UBI for 200 people. Well, that's not universal. No. So by definition, that's not UBI. At a conceptual level, I just don't think UBI would work. I think when you look at like targeted cash transfers, there's a strong argument that cash transfers are the most effective form of charity in general. So there's a charity called Give Directly that basically uses cell phones to directly send cash transfers to poor people in various parts of like sub-Saharan Africa and other low-income places. And what ends up happening often is that those people, like the people on the ground, know best what to do with their money. So they're like, hey, like my roof is leaking. I have a tin roof that's leaking. That's a huge issue. Or like, hey, like I can start a business. I just need some seed money to like start a local like business. I need to buy some like a boat to like do fishing or whatever. The reason why that does not lead to inflation is that inflation at the end of the day is a monetary issue. But I think there's a supply and demand side to a cash transfer. Obviously, it increases demand for goods and services. But if a group of poor people can become more productive through cash transfers, that can increase the supply of goods and services as well. And so there's a strong argument that targeted transfers to very poor people can also increase the supply of goods and services. I think once you universalize that, it becomes problematic because, like if every single person in the world makes an extra, or like if every single person in the US, for example, makes an extra $1,000, I mean, you're just changing, you're just changing the zeros in a bank account across the board without changing the overall economic activity. I think there's a strong argument that a lot of the inflation during the COVID era was because of a lot of those. There were like the 3 big stimulus payments from the federal government. I don't think that really was enough to make a difference, but a lot of states had, expanded programs of cash injections. And I honestly wonder if a lot of those things led to inflation. Because inflation was caused by, a lot of the sort of monetary stimulus, number one. Number two was supply shocks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then number 3 was supply shocks of supply chain issues tied to COVID. So overall, this is just my opinion, but I just don't think UBI from a theoretical framework, I just don't think it makes sense.
Not really. Not till I think talking about when UBI makes sense is more of a sci-fi argument than a right now argument. Like
so there's a theory
that when things get really automated, it might be a thing, but I don't think we're there yet.
So what automation does is it shifts. So for a given organization, for a given company, when you automate things, it shifts the share of capital the share of profits going to capital versus labor. Because, that's what automation is, right? Is like there's less labor involved. So, perhaps you can make an argument, in a sort of techno utopia, like almost everything is automated. In a traditional capitalist system, almost all of that money would go to capital. So maybe you could argue, like, well, would UBI be a way to kind of distribute that money? As things stand now, I think that's I think it's a little premature to like think about that. Is kind of my opinion.
I think it'll come. The time when we need UBI is right before the right before the fusion reactors get here.
Right. So that was part 1 of our episode on welfare. We'll do part 2 next.